Weinstein. I'm an evolutionary biologist. I'm not going to present new data on the COVID pandemic. That's not what I do. What I do is untangle the logic of complex biological systems, whether those systems are epidemiological, immunological, physiological, psychological, or sociological. In the case of the COVID crisis, it was all of the above. I'm going to tell a story in 4 parts. First, I'm going to discuss medicine. Second, I'll discuss business. Third, I will unpack the strange events of the COVID pandemic itself. And fourth, I will direct our attention to the future of the free world and ultimately the human race. We begin with medicine. Let's start with an obvious but easily forgotten fact. The human body is a miracle. It is exquisitely constructed to build, maintain, and reproduce itself, and it does so over an uncommonly long lifespan. With that said, the human body isn't perfect. It's fairly easy to improve the health of most people. That is a paradox. If we are evolutionarily well designed, then why is it so easy to improve us? The answer tells us a lot about medicine, what it should be, what it has become, and what we should be doing about the huge gap between those things. The answer to the paradox, the reason that it is so easy to improve the health of most people, is that they are sick with diseases of novelty. We are creatures living in an environment unlike the environments in which we evolved. When we improve people's health, we do not do it by improving on their evolutionary design. We do so by restoring the conditions in which their design functions well. This may be accomplished by correcting a novel deficiency, or by adjusting an imbalance in the modern diet, or by encouraging exercise to reestablish biological feedbacks. Here's another obvious but seldom discussed fact. It is very unlikely that you will improve the health of a patient by introducing something unnatural into their bodies. Now, the mind of every doctor in the room is likely racing to find exceptions to this rule, and there are some. But most of the compounds that seem like exceptions, antibiotics, digitalis, salicylic acid, quinine, ivermectin, are not fundamentally products of technology. They aren't unnatural. Most are poisons built by one creature to interfere with the physiology of another. That is why nature is so full of medicines. Creatures have many reasons to chemically alter the function of other organisms, and we can repurpose their tools for our medical objectives. In other words, really useful drugs are themselves products of natural selection. But what about vaccines? I will acknowledge that my perspective on vaccines has shifted radically over the last several years. I was a true believer. The mechanism of vaccination is so elegant that I was blinded to the modern reality of this medical technique. Here's some of what I have learned. The original vaccines were living pathogens that had been chosen or created because they did minimal harm to the patient, but had enough molecular similarity to the targeted disease that they could provide an adaptive immune system with proper training. These live attenuated vaccines leverage something very similar to natural immunity because they create a real infection that the body understands. But giving patients an infection is risky. Some patients may be unusually vulnerable and suffer a serious reaction. Even more concerning, with live pathogens, natural selection poses a serious risk that the attenuated, non-contagious vaccine organism could evolve into something else. So the industry settled on another technology, dead pathogens or fragments of them. This solves one problem, but exchanges it for another. Since dead pathogens don't cause a proper infection, the immune system is generally unimpressed by them, and robust immunity does not tend to develop. To solve that problem, the vaccine industry settled on the idea of adjuvants. Adjuvants are compounds that irritate the immune system so it reacts strongly to the antigens in the vaccine. That makes sense as far as it goes, but it creates other hazards which should give us pause. Adjuvants are not specific to the disease we are trying to immunize against. They give the immune system a general signal that the body is under attack, and the very clear danger exists that immunity will develop to things that are not a threat, either to oneself or to harmless features of the environment. To be clear, this is only a hypothesis to explain an otherwise mysterious pattern, the explosion of autoimmune disorders and environmental allergies that we have seen in recent generations. I'll use myself as an example. I have discovered I have a very serious allergy to wheat. I can think of no simple reason that this should be the case. My ancestors have been eating wheat for thousands of years. I should tolerate it well, and yet the slightest exposure causes me to have numerous debilitating symptoms. Is that because I received an adjuvant-based vaccine and my immune system reacted not just to the antigens delivered in the shot, but also to the wheat in my gut? I would similarly ask why several of my friends have been forced to move from their homes by sensitivity to mold growing in these buildings. Is this type of mold really new? Or have these people gone home after receiving an injection and become sensitized to spores that they previously tolerated? Medicine works best when doctors function as scientists, seeking the root causes of disease and restoring the patient to a natural state in which the internal logic of the body can maintain the patient's health. Good doctors are reluctant about all medications, especially highly novel ones. Now let's shift to business. There are good medications, and presumably there are diseases for which a proper vaccine is the right approach. Unfortunately for doctors and their patients, good medicine is bad business. Imagine for a moment that pharma was only allowed to sell drugs that were actually both safe and effective, and that doctors worked to avoid prescriptions, and when they couldn't, to prescribe the best drug for as short a time as possible to return the patient to a drug-free state of health. In such a world, pharma would be a lot less big and a whole lot less profitable. Not only would patients be taking many fewer pills, but the pills that they did take would tend to be for older drugs for which the risks and effects were well understood. In other words, repurposed drugs would dominate a world where doctors were truly incentivized to look out for the health of their patients. But we don't live in that world. We live in a world where the logic of the market has inverted everything. Pharma is healthy when people are sick. It should not surprise us that they have used their influence to create their ideal conditions, conditions in which their profits are maximized irrespective of how many lives are destroyed. The only harms we should expect pharma to care about are the ones that show up at their bottom line. What most of us did not fully understand until the COVID pandemic was the breathtaking extent of pharma's control over universities, medical journals, governmental regulators, legislators, investigative journalists, search engines, and social media platforms. COVID fully revealed this for the first time and provides us with the best window we are likely to ever have on the processes that are destroying our minds, our bodies, and our civilization. So let's now look at the COVID pandemic specifically. I'm going to describe something I call the game of pharma. Pharmaceutical companies are businesses that hold intellectual property rights over bioactive substances. They make money when they can successfully claim that a substance that they own has a plausible value in counteracting some disease. Their profits go up if the disease afflicts a lot of people, if the disease is particularly dangerous, if the drug seems to work better than the competition, if the drug is safer than the competition, if it speeds through safety and efficacy trials, if the manufacturer is immunized from liability, if the government mandates the drug, if the government buys the drug, and if the public wants the drug. Long before COVID, public had perfected tricks for gaming all of these parameters. Pharma knew how to fake efficacy. It knew how to hide adverse events. It knew how to make diseases look more threatening to more people than they actually are. And it knew how to get the government to do its bidding, accelerating approval processes and taking liability off the table. What should have happened during the COVID pandemic is that doctors should have started treating patients based on their symptoms. They would have made mistakes early on. That is the nature of medicine. People would have died. But doctors would have gotten good at treating COVID, and they would have gotten good rapidly. There are, after all, numerous drugs in the existing pharmacopoeia that effectively control the harms of COVID for all but the oldest and sickest patients. I want now to take a shot at explaining what happened instead and why it happened. Again, we are in the realm of hypothesis. The game of pharma begins with the ownership of a patent, usually for a drug, and pharma companies then create the scientific impression that it is safe, effective, and better than anything as an alternative. But it doesn't have to be a drug, and pharma had something incredible sitting on its shelf. It had a remarkable technology, one with the potential to revolutionize not just our approach to one disease, but to all infectious diseases, globally, for the foreseeable future and likely well beyond. This technology had been in the works for 3.5 decades, but it could not be brought to market because, as brilliant as it was, it had a flaw that no one knew how to solve. I'm speaking of the mRNA transfection platform, which had the potential to replace every vaccine in existence and to radically streamline the process of creating and testing new immunizations. The problem was that inoculations using this platform could not be made tolerably safe because the lipid nanoparticles that carried the mRNA into the body could not be narrowly targeted. It would transfect whatever cells it encountered as it circulated around the body. And once transfected, the cells in question, after they started producing foreign protein, would inevitably be destroyed by the body's own natural killer and cytotoxic T cells, which would mistake these transfected cells for those that had been virally infected. That would be bad wherever in the body it happened, but it would be devastating within the hearts of those unlucky enough to be transfected there. The reason transfection of heart cells is so dangerous is that the heart is essential to keeping the body alive each and every minute. And at the same time, hearts are particularly bad at replacing damaged tissue. If one survives the wounding of their heart, the best one can hope for is a scar. It's impossible to estimate how much money could be made with the mRNA platform, as it had the potential to spit out one patentable shot after another indefinitely into the future. Hundreds of billions of dollars? Surely. Trillions? Perhaps. But it didn't matter because the adverse event signal would be beyond even pharma's amazing ability to cover up disability and death. So you can imagine pharma's frustration at having so much money permanently just out of reach. But there was one thing that could put the mRNA transfection platform into play, potentially unlocking all that wealth for pharma. An emergency that would terrify the public, accelerate safety testing, and get government to buy the shots, force them on the public, and take liability off the table. It looks to me like pharma was focused from the beginning on something other than COVID. I suspect their deeper objective was to use the emergency to get the public to accept the mRNA platform and to normalize in the public mind whatever harms could not be obscured. This would explain the bizarre obsession with forcing absolutely everyone, including kids, to take the shots, because pharma's biggest fear would be the existence of a sizable control group in which the mRNA transfected could be compared. A large population of resistors would make the pattern of harm readily detectable. So pandemic of the unvaccinated is what they shouted. It would also explain the intense demonization of hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, and all the frontline doctors who quickly figured out how to treat COVID patients, because those doctors wielding those drugs would reduce fear, causing many people to opt out of these radically novel shots. What we got during COVID was a coup against medicine, inverting the natural, bottom-up accumulation of medical wisdom by clinicians and replacing it with a top-down authoritarian approach in which new profitable pharmaceuticals are mandated and their generic repurposed competitors are banned. This coup came disguised as public health. It wielded weapons like standards of care, peer review, evidence-based medicine, and randomized controlled trials. All of these things fit in a category. The label on the box does not match the contents. Public health is no longer about making the public healthy. Peer review is not the same as review by one's scientific peers. Evidence-based medicine is not about medicine being based on evidence. And when huge profits are on the line, randomized controlled trials are neither randomized nor controlled. This coup against medicine aimed all these weapons directly at the most fundamental principles of the profession. Not just the methods and regulations, but the most important obligations that doctors have, the Hippocratic Oath and the Nuremberg Code. And it all becomes obvious why when you realize that the well-being of pharmaceutical companies is inversely correlated to the health of patients. Pharma needs doctors to abandon their obligation to patients, to prefer new profitable drugs over tried and true medicines, and it requires doctors to accept experimentation on their patients without their informed consent. We don't talk about informed consent enough. Those two words should have been the end of the debate. This principle of medicine, this requirement is so clear and so important that the World War II allies tried and executed 7 doctors for violating it. You simply can't mandate or coerce mRNA transfection onto patients who don't understand it and don't want it. Why? Because that's a double violation of informed consent, and that's a hanging offense, Dr. Fauci. So, why didn't their plan to fully normalize the mRNA platform work? There are 2 important reasons. First, the enemies of freedom and health did not anticipate the emergence of an army of experts with both integrity and courage. They failed to anticipate this because they themselves lack integrity and courage, and they literally couldn't comprehend it. Second, the enemies of freedom did not understand what a podcast was or why it should matter. They had spent so much time, effort, and money successfully corrupting the traditional media that they were sure they could convince the public of whatever narrative they wished to deliver. In short, we beat the pharma fascists because they didn't know we would stand up, find each other, and hold discussions in the new public square. Well, there's a lot more to say, but I guess I should leave it there in order to give Dr. Malone his full... No? Keep going? All right. I think I got to surrender the microphone. Thank you for listening.